They tell you she was a monster. They say her heart was made of iron and her hands were soaked in the blood of the innocent. But history has a way of hiding the smell of rotting flesh beneath the weight of a crown. Before she was a ghost in your mirror, she was a woman whose own body became her executioner. This isn't just a story of a queen's reign. This is the clinical, agonizing autopsy of a soul. This is the final, blackened breath of the woman they called Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor did not enter the world as a monster. She entered it as a miracle. Born on a cold February morning in 1516 at Greenwich Palace, she was the pearl of the realm. To her father, the towering and terrifying Henry VIII, she was the proof that his dynasty was blessed. To her mother, Catherine of Aragon, she was the sacred answer to 1,000 desperate prayers. For a few brief years, Mary lived in a world of silk, Latin poetry, and the doting eyes of a king. She was a diplomatic prize, a princess whose hand in marriage was worth more than gold. But in the Tudor court, love is a fragile thing, and power is a predatory animal. As Mary reached the edge of womanhood, the golden cradle turned into a cage. Her father's obsession with a male heir, and his infatuation with the dark-eyed Anne Boleyn, shattered Mary's world. In a single, seismic shift, the king broke from Rome, discarded her mother, and branded Mary a bastard. The pearl was cast into the mud. She was stripped of her title, separated from her mother, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her own infant half-sister, Elizabeth. This was the first death of Mary Tudor. She watched from the shadows as her mother died in exile, denied even a final embrace. She learned that loyalty was a death sentence and that faith was the only thing the king could not take from her. These were the years that forged her iron. She became a creature of resistance, her identity rooted in two things: her mother's Spanish honor and the Catholic Mass. While the world around her turned Protestant to please the king, Mary stood still. She was a silent, stubborn ghost in the halls of power, waiting for a crown that the world said she no longer deserved. When her young brother Edward died, they tried to bypass her again. They tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. But Mary did something no woman in England had ever done. She rode. She gathered an army. She marched into London with the roar of the people behind her. On July 19, 1553, she was no longer the bastard daughter. She was the queen. But the throne she won was built on a foundation of trauma. She took the crown not to rule, but to avenge. She didn't know then that the weight of that gold would eventually crush her bones. Quiz. What did Mary lose before she won the crown? A. Her eyesight. B. Her memory. C. Her voice. D. Her legitimacy. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights and more quizzes. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The bells of London rang for Mary, but the air was thick with a new kind of tension. A queen without a king was considered a ship without a rudder. Mary was 37, and her biological clock was a ticking drum in the silence of her chambers. To secure the Catholic restoration and ensure her mother's bloodline lived on, she needed a husband. She didn't look to the English lords who had betrayed her mother. She looked across the sea, to the sun-drenched palaces of Spain. She chose Philip II. He was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, a man of cold majesty and vast power. To Mary, this was not just a marriage, it was a holy alliance. She fell in love with a portrait before she ever saw the man. She saw in Philip a savior who would help her return England to the true faith. But England did not share her heart. The people feared the Spanish. They feared foreign gold and foreign chains. Riots broke out. Rebellion knocked at the palace doors. Mary, however, remained immovable. She married Philip in 1554 in a ceremony of glittering gold and dark omens. Philip, a man of pragmatic ice, looked at his aging, desperate bride with a clinical detachment. He did not love her. He needed her for her navy and her position against France. As the months passed, Mary's joy turned into a haunting obsession. By late 1554, she felt a stirring. Her abdomen began to swell. Her morning sickness was real. The court doctors, eager to please a queen who held the power of life and death, confirmed the miracle. Mary was pregnant. The news spread like wildfire. Te Deums were sung in the cathedrals. Baby clothes were stitched with silver thread. But as the months turned to 9, then 10, then 11, the nursery remained silent. There was no child. Her belly, once distended with hope, began to recede, leaving behind nothing but loose skin and a shattered mind. It was a phantom pregnancy, a cruel trick played by a mind so desperate for a legacy that it forced the body to lie. Philip, disgusted by the public humiliation and bored by his doting, sickly wife, left for the continent. He left Mary alone in a palace that felt more like a tomb. The rejection was the poison that started the rot. Abandoned by her husband and mocked by her subjects, Mary turned her grief outward. If she could not give God a child, she would give him the souls of heretics. The fires of Smithfield were lit. The air in London began to taste of charcoal and human fat. Every execution was a prayer, and every scream was a sacrifice she hoped would win back God's favor. She was trying to burn her way to a salvation that kept slipping through her fingers. Quiz. What grew inside the Queen's womb? A. A future king. B. A dark secret. C. A hollow hope. D. A hidden poison. The year 1555 arrived with a frost that seemed to settle in Mary's very marrow. The palace was no longer a place of music and dance. It was a fortress of prayer and paranoia. Philip was gone, his letters becoming shorter, colder, and further apart. Mary sat in the dim light of her private oratory, her eyes red from weeping and incense smoke. She believed the silence of her womb was a divine indictment. God was hiding his face because England was unclean. To Mary, the Protestant Reformation was not a theological shift. It was a plague that had murdered her mother's peace and her father's soul. She decided to cut the cancer out. She revived the old heresy laws. The machinery of the state turned into a giant stake. On February 4th, the first fire was lit. John Rogers, a preacher, was burned alive in front of his wife and 11 children. This was not a quick death. The wood was often damp, the wind often cruel. The victims did not just die, they cooked. And as the smoke rose over London, something in the English psyche snapped. The Queen sat in her chambers, signing death warrants with a hand that had begun to tremble. She was not a sadist who took pleasure in the pain, but a fanatic who believed in the mercy of the flame. She believed that a few minutes of earthly fire would save these souls from an eternity of hell. But the more she burned, the more the people hated her. The martyrs did not scream for mercy, they sang psalms. They held their hands in the flames until they turned to charcoal, looking at the crowds with eyes that saw a different kingdom. Among the dead were giants like Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer, the man who had annulled her mother's marriage, was forced to watch his friends die before his own turn came. When he finally stood at the stake, he thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed his recantation, into the fire first. "This hand hath offended," he cried. The stench of burning flesh became the background of Mary's reign. It clung to the tapestries of St. James's Palace. It settled in the folds of the Queen's velvet gowns. No amount of rose water or lavender could mask it. Her subjects began to whisper a name that would outlive her by centuries, Bloody Mary. But while the fires burned outside, a different kind of heat was consuming the Queen from within. Her health began a slow, terrifying collapse. She suffered from blinding headaches that felt like iron spikes driven into her temples. Her digestion failed, leaving her stomach cramped and bloated. She began to see shadows in the corners of her room, ghosts of the men she had sent to the pyre, or perhaps the ghost of the daughter she could never be. She was ruling a kingdom of ash, and her own body was starting to turn to dust. Quiz: what did the queen believe the fires would do? A. Warm the palace. B. Purify the soul. C. Scare the Spanish. D. Melt the crown. By 1557, the queen was a hollowed-out version of the woman who had once claimed the throne in triumph. The fires of Smithfield were still burning, but they could no longer warm the coldness in Mary's heart. Philip returned briefly, not out of love, but because he needed England's blood and treasure for a war against France. Mary, still pathetically infatuated, agreed to everything. The result was a disaster that broke her spirit. Calais, the last English possession on French soil, a symbol of English pride for over 200 years, was lost in a single week. To the English people, it was a national humiliation. To Mary, it was a sign that God had truly turned his back on her. "When I am dead," she rasped, "you shall find Calais lying in my heart." But the heartbreak was nothing compared to the physical horror taking root in her tissues. Her body began to exhibit symptoms that baffled the royal physicians. Her skin, once pale and regal, began to turn a sickly, waxen yellow. Jaundice had set in, a silent herald of liver failure. But even more terrifying were the dark patches appearing on her back and abdomen. In the dim light of her bedchamber, her ladies-in-waiting whispered in terror. These were not bruises. They were patches of necrosis, living flesh turning black and dying while still attached to her body. The stench in the royal apartments became a physical war. The queen was rotting from the inside out. She believed she was pregnant again. It was the same cruel mimicry: the swollen belly, the stopped menstruation, the morning sickness. But this time, the court didn't sew baby clothes. They watched with a mixture of pity and revulsion as the queen's stomach grew not with life, but with fluid and tumors. Modern science looks back and sees the likely culprits: ovarian cancer or a massive uterine tumor, spreading like a vine through her midsection, choking her organs. Her mind, once sharp enough to debate theologians in Latin, began to fray. The fevers burned away her grasp on reality. She would scream at her servants, accusing them of poisoning her food, only to weep and beg for their forgiveness moments later. She hallucinated that the walls were seeping blood, the blood of the 300 she had sent to the stake. She spent her nights pacing the floor until her swollen, blackened feet gave out. She was no longer a monarch. She was a prisoner of her own decaying biology, waiting for a verdict that only death could deliver. Quiz: what appeared on the queen's skin? A. Royal tattoos. B. Blackened rot. C. Golden scales. D. Silver scars. By the autumn of 1558, the luxury of St. James's Palace had become a gilded morgue. The queen was no longer a person. She was a medical mystery shrouded in silk. The air in her private chambers was so thick with the smell of decay that even the most hardened courtiers would cover their mouths with scented handkerchiefs before entering. The physical transition was grotesque. Her legs had swollen to twice their size. The skin stretched so thin it began to weep a clear, yellowish fluid. The blackened patches of necrosis had spread, moving from her abdomen to her thighs. Every breath was a rattling struggle, a sound that echoed through the silent hallways like a dry branch scraping against a window. Mary lay in a bed that was constantly damp. Her ladies changed the linens 5, 6, 7 times a day, but the moisture returned, a mixture of sweat from her racking fevers and the leakage from her failing body. Her eyes, once a piercing blue, were now clouded and yellowed by jaundice. She was blind to the world around her, but her internal vision was hyper-focused on her failures. She knew she was dying, and she knew that her death meant the end of everything she had bled for. In her rare moments of lucidity, she called for her sister, Elizabeth. The two had never loved each other. Elizabeth was the daughter of the woman who had destroyed Mary's mother. Elizabeth was a Protestant. Elizabeth was young, healthy, and vibrant, everything Mary was not. Yet, Mary was forced to sign the papers naming Elizabeth her heir. As her trembling hand held the pen, she wasn't just signing a document. She was signing the death warrant of her own legacy. She knew that the moment she drew her last breath, the Latin masses would stop, the monasteries would stay in ruins, and the fires she had lit would be extinguished by her sister's hand. The neurological decay was perhaps the most painful to watch. Mary began to hold conversations with people who weren't there. She would reach out her claw-like hands to cradle a phantom child, whispering lullabies to the empty air. Then, the vision would shift, and she would scream in terror, pushing away invisible figures that crowded around her bed. Were they the Protestant martyrs? Or was it her father, Henry, coming to reclaim the bastard daughter he had once discarded? She was a queen drowning in a sea of shadows, her crown a heavy anchor pulling her down into the dark. Quiz. What sound filled the queen's bedroom? A. Angelic choirs. B. Death rattles. C. Spanish music. D. Silent prayers. The dawn of November 17th, 1558, did not bring light to St. James's Palace. It only brought a deeper gray. The queen had reached the end of her endurance. Her body, once a vessel of royal blood, was now a ruin of blackened skin and shattered hope. The physicians had long since stopped their useless poultices. The priests had taken over, their chanting the only thing standing between Mary and the final silence. In those last hours, the room was kept in near-total darkness. Mary's eyes could no longer bear the light. She lay perfectly still, her breathing so shallow that several times her ladies thought she had already slipped away. But then, a finger would twitch, or a low moan would escape her cracked, blackened lips. She was trapped in the in-between, a place where the physical pain of her rotting organs met the spiritual terror of her soul's journey. Legend says that just before the end, she looked at the ceiling and saw flames. Not the holy fires of her faith, but the fire of a legacy she could no longer control. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the rattling in her chest finally stopped. The Queen of England was dead. She was 42 years old, but she looked like a woman of 80, her face aged by grief and a disease that had eaten her from within. There was no grand mourning in the streets of London. Instead, there was a strange, heavy silence. The fires at Smithfield died out that day, never to be lit in her name again. As Mary's body was prepared for burial, the final horror was revealed to the few who remained. The decay was so advanced that her body had begun to decompose while she was still breathing. The stench was so powerful it reportedly seeped into the very wood of the bed frame. They wrapped her in lead and wax, trying to seal away the physical evidence of her suffering. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, but the stone above her would eventually be claimed by her sister, Elizabeth. Even in the grave, Mary was pushed into the shadows. History was written by those she persecuted. They took her pain and turned it into a slur. They took her trauma and turned it into a ghost story. They called her Bloody Mary, and in doing so, they erased the woman who had lived in agony. They forgot the child who was cast aside, the wife who was abandoned, and the queen who believed she was saving a world that only wanted her gone. Today, she is a name whispered in a dark room, a face in a mirror that frightens children. But beneath the myth lies a deeper truth. Mary Tudor was a martyr to her own convictions, a woman who burned with a fire she thought was divine, only to find that fire consumed her first. She didn't leave a child behind, but she left a shadow that refuses to leave the pages of history. Quiz. What happened to Mary's grave eventually? A. It was stolen. B. Elizabeth shared it. C. It was burned. D. It was lost. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.